Each night, in the biting cold and unforgiving darkness, a small puppy curled up outside the entrance of the town hospital. Despite the weather and the busy foot traffic, he remained there, unwavering, as though waiting for someone who would never come. When Dr. Thomas Walker finally took notice of this peculiar visitor and uncovered the heartbreaking truth behind his presence, it moved him in ways he never expected. It was a particularly frigid evening. The golden glow of the hospital's lights reflected against the icy pavement, where bundled-up visitors and weary patients hurried through the revolving doors. Among the chaos, a single, unmoving figure stood out, a small, shivering puppy with matted fur and sorrowful eyes, curled up just beyond the entrance. He neither begged for food nor sought warmth. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on the entrance, as though anticipating someone's return. Dr. Thomas Walker, a senior pediatrician known for his relentless work ethic and no-nonsense demeanor, noticed the puppy for the first time as he exited the hospital. The sight of the animal, so still and determined, stopped him in his tracks. "What's he doing here?" he muttered to himself, tightening his scarf against the wind. A passing nurse overheard him. "He's been here for weeks, doctor. Poor thing must be waiting for someone inside." Thomas frowned, glancing back at the hospital entrance. The thought gnawed at him. Could the puppy's owner be among the patients? Or worse, had they already passed away, leaving this loyal creature behind? The following evening, Thomas stepped out of the hospital once more, burdened by paperwork and the long hours of his shift. Yet, in the very same spot, lay the puppy. Snow had begun to fall. Light flakes clinging to the little dog's fur, but he remained unshaken. His focus never wavered from the hospital doors. Thomas hesitated. He wasn't an animal person, never had been, but something about this tiny, unwavering creature tugged at his heart. He took a cautious step forward and crouched down, keeping a respectful distance. "You're still here?" His voice was soft, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The puppy lifted his head slightly, ears twitching, but made no move to approach. Its deep, expressive eyes met Thomas's, and for the first time in years, something unfamiliar stirred in the doctor's chest. "Do you have an owner?" Thomas asked, almost to himself. The janitor, making his nightly rounds, chuckled as it passed. "Talking to that mutt again, Doc. Been here for weeks. Some folks say he's waiting for someone." Thomas glanced back at the hospital, his mind racing. Was this little creature truly waiting for someone inside, or had the person he loved already gone, leaving behind nothing but an unfulfilled promise? Chapter 2. A Silent Companion. Night after night, the puppy remained. Thomas, unable to ignore his presence, started lingering by the entrance longer than usual. The mystery of the dog's unwavering patience gnawed at him. He had seen loyalty before, but this was something deeper. One particularly bitter evening, Thomas couldn't stand the sight of the shivering puppy any longer. With a quiet sigh, he retrieved a small blanket from his car and draped it gently over the little dog. "Here, this should help." To his surprise, the puppy didn't resist. He simply adjusted slightly beneath the warmth, his big, trusting eyes meeting Thomas's before shifting back to the hospital doors. The sight haunted the doctor that night, keeping him awake long after he had settled into bed. By the next morning, Thomas had made a decision. During his lunch break, he approached the receptionist. "Has anyone reported a missing dog?" The woman typed swiftly on her keyboard before shaking her head. "No reports, doctor. You think it belongs to a patient?" "I don't know," Thomas admitted, "but I want to find out." As the days passed, his quiet curiosity turned into determination. He began leaving food and water for the puppy, noting with satisfaction that the bowls were always empty by morning. But despite his efforts, the dog remained distant, his loyalty bound only to the hospital doors. One evening, as Thomas sat in his car preparing to leave, he glanced back at the puppy, curled up in his usual spot. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, frustration mixing with helplessness. "Why won't you leave?" he murmured. The question wasn't born out of annoyance, but a growing sense of responsibility. He felt as though he was failing this tiny creature, who seemed to be waiting for something or someone Thomas could not provide. The following weekend, everything changed. As he approached the hospital, he saw a small crowd gathered around the puppy. A nurse, Sarah, knelt beside him, gently stroking his head. He finally let someone touch him, she said, beaming as Thomas approached. It's like he's starting to trust us. Thomas hesitated before kneeling as well. Slowly, he reached out, his hand hovering just above the puppy's fur. Is that true, buddy? Are you finally warming up to us? To his astonishment, the puppy didn't pull away. Instead, he looked up at Thomas with eyes brimming with both hope and sadness. And in that moment, the doctor knew could no longer ignore this dog's silent plea for answers. Who was this little soul waiting for? And why couldn't Thomas shake the feeling that this was more than just loyalty, that it was a love so deep it defied even death itself? The night air was crisp, the distant hum of traffic barely audible against the soft whistling wind. Thomas leaned against the entrance of the hospital, his eyes fixed on the small bundle of fur curled up on the frowning pavement. The little dog, now somewhat accustomed to his presence, barely stirred at the sound of the doctor's footsteps approaching. Sarah, the kind-hearted nurse who had managed to touch the dog the night before, stepped up beside Thomas. You're thinking about taking him in, aren't you? She asked knowingly, her breath visible in the cold night air. Thomas sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know. There's something about him. It's like he's tied to this place, waiting for someone. I just don't know who or why. Sarah crouched down beside the dog, stroking his fur with slow, gentle movements. I think you already care more than you realize. Thomas exhaled sharply, reluctant to admit the truth in her words. Caring was dangerous. It led to disappointment, loss. He had seen it too many times in his line of work, and yet something about this small, loyal creature had pierced through his well-guarded walls. Determined to find answers, Thomas decided to do some digging. The next morning, before his shift, he visited the hospital's records office. He combed through patient admissions from the past several weeks, searching for anything that might explain the dog's presence. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with thick glasses perched on her nose, gave him a quizzical look as he sorted through the files. Looking for something specific, Dr. Walker? She asked. Just trying to solve a little mystery, he replied, scanning names and dates. Did we have any long-term patients who might have had a dog? She thought for a moment before shaking her head. Not that I can recall. Most of the recent cases were either short stays or had family around. Thomas frowned. What about patients who didn't have family? She pursed her lips and tapped a few keys on her keyboard. There was one, she said after a moment. Edward Langley. He was admitted about 3 weeks ago. Heart failure. No listed next of kin. Thomas's heartbeat quickened. What happened to him? The receptionist hesitated, a flicker of sadness in her expression. He passed away a few days after admission. The realization hit Thomas like a blow to the chest. Could Edward Langley have been the dog's owner? Had the little dog followed him to the hospital, only to be left waiting outside for a man who would never return? Determined to find out more, Thomas decided to visit Langley's listed address. After his shift, he drove across town to a small, modest home on the outskirts of the city. The house was old, but well-maintained, though the front yard had grown slightly overgrown. A single light flickered in the window, suggesting someone had been there recently. He knocked on the door, his fingers stiff from the cold. A few moments later, an elderly woman peered out from behind the curtains before cautiously opening the door. Can I help you? She asked, her voice weary. Thomas offered a reassuring smile. My name is Dr. Thomas Walker. I work at the hospital where Edward Langley was treated. At the mention of Langley's name, the woman's expression softened. Oh, dear Edward, she murmured, shaking her head. Such a kind man. It's a shame what happened. Did you know him well? Thomas asked. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson, nodded. He was my neighbor for years, lived alone, but it wasn't lonely, not as long as he had Bruno. Bruno, his dog, she explained. A little thing, brown and loyal as they come, followed Edward everywhere. It broke my heart when Edward was taken away. Bruno didn't understand. He kept waiting by the door for him to come home. Thomas's chest tightened. There was no doubt now Bruno was the same dog who had been waiting outside the hospital all this time. Do you know what happened to him after Edward was taken to the hospital? Thomas asked. Mrs. Patterson sighed. I tried to take care of him, but he refused to leave the porch. Then, one day, he was gone. I suppose he must have followed Edward's scent. He must have made it all the way to the hospital on his own. Thomas was stunned. The little dog had traveled across town, braving the harsh winter, just to be close to the only person he had ever loved. The sheer devotion in that act sent a lump to his throat. Returning to the hospital, Thomas Saturday on the cold steps beside Bruno, watching as his tiny frame trembled in the cold. He reached out, brushing his fingers through the dog's fur. You're waiting for someone who isn't coming back, aren't you? Bruno looked up at him, and in that moment, Thomas saw something in those deep brown eyes show grief and an unbreakable bond that even death hadn't severed. He sighed, rubbing his face. All right, Bruno, you win. That night, for the first time since he had started noticing the little dog, Thomas didn't walk away. Instead, he carefully scooped up Bruno in his arms, carrying him to the warmth of his car. As they drove home, the little dog curled up in the passenger seat, finally resting, as though realizing he wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas didn't feel alone either. The soft hum of the car engine filled the silence. As Thomas drove through the quiet streets, the little dog curled up on the passenger seat. He kept sneaking glances at the small figure beside him, watching the steady rise and fall of his tiny chest. The dog Brenna seemed calmer now, no longer shivering against the cold. Thomas tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He had never been one for pets. His life was already a storm of long shifts, paperwork, and sleepless nights. He barely had time for himself, let alone another living being that needed care. And yet, as he looked at Bruno's frail form, something within him softened. By the time he pulled into the driveway of his modest home, the snow had begun to fall heavier, blanketing the pavement in a soft, silent sheet. Thomas sighed as he turned off the ignition. Well, Bruno, he muttered, guess you're staying with me tonight. Carefully, he scooped the dog into his arms. Bruno stirred slightly but didn't resist. Thomas could feel the warmth of his tiny body against his chest. The heart beat steady but faint. It had been a long journey for the little creature, and exhaustion was finally claiming him. Inside, Thomas sat him down gently on the living room couch and hurried to fetch an old blanket. Wrapping Bruno in it, he watched as the dog curled into the warmth, letting out a soft sigh. Thomas ran a hand through his hair. I can't believe I'm doing this. He had never imagined himself taking in a pet, let alone one that carried such a heavy story. This wasn't just a stray dog. This was a creature who had loved and lost, who had waited in vain outside the hospital doors for an owner who would never return. The thought made Thomas's chest tighten. As he moved to the kitchen, he realized he had nothing remotely close to dog food. With a sigh, he grabbed a slice of turkey from the fridge, tearing it into small pieces before setting them in a dish. Bruno lifted his head slightly, sniffed the air, then slowly inched toward the food. That's all I've got for now, Thomas said, watching as the dog hesitantly ate. We'll have to get you proper food in the morning. Bruno's eyes lifted to Medius, and for a moment, Thomas swore he saw gratitude in them. It was strange how much a simple look could say without a single word being spoken. That night, Thomas lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He had done countless surgeries, saved lives, and faced situations that would shake any normal person. But this felt different. Taking in Bruno felt like stepping into something unknown, something he wasn't sure he was ready for. Yet, deep down, he knew the truth. He couldn't turn his back on Bruno any more than he could ignore a patient in need. The next morning, Thomas woke to the soft sound of paws patting against the wooden floor. Blinking away the remnants of sleep, he Saturday up and found Bruno sitting beside the bed, staring up at him with expectant eyes. Thomas groaned, rubbing his face. "You're really staying?" Bruno's tail wagged slightly. Shaking his head, Thomas threw back the covers and got up. He dressed quickly, then grabbed his keys. "All right, let's get you some real food." At that pet store, Thomas felt completely out of his element. He wandered the aisles, staring blankly at the overwhelming selection of dog food, pets, and toys. A cheerful store assistant approached him, a knowing smile on her face. "First-time dog owner," she guessed. Thomas let out a tired chuckle. "Is it that obvious?" She nodded. "You've got the completely lost look down. What kind of dog do you have?" Thomas hesitated. Small, brown, apparently named Bruno." She smiled. "All right, let's start with the basics." With her help, Thomas left the store with a bag of high-quality dog food, a small bed, and a leash. As he loaded the supplies into his car, he couldn't believe how quickly his life had shifted. Less than 24 hours ago, he hadn't given this dog a second thought. Now, he was shopping for him. Back home, he set up Bruno's new bed in a corner of the living room. The dog sniffed it hesitantly before stepping in and curling up. "Well," Thomas muttered, "I guess that means you approve." Bruno yawned, his tiny body finally at ease. Thomas Saturday on the couch, watching him. The quiet was oddly comforting. Maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be so bad after all. Days passed, and a quiet routine began to settle between them. Thomas would leave early for the hospital, ensuring Bruno had food and water before he left. In the evenings, Bruno would greet him at the door, tail wagging, as if he had been waiting all day for his return. At first, Thomas tried to maintain some emotional distance. He told himself Bruno was just a temporary guest dog he had taken in to keep safe from the cold. But as the days turned into weeks, he knew better. Bruno wasn't just a stray anymore. He was family. One night, as Thomas Saturday on the couch reviewing patient charts, he felt a warm weight settle beside him. Bruno had climbed onto the couch, resting his head against Thomas's leg. Thomas smiled, setting his papers aside to gently stroke Bruno's fur. "Guess you're comfortable now, The dog let out a content sigh, his eyes closing. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas felt something close to peace. But even as their bond grew stronger, the unanswered questions still lingered. Edward Langley had died, leaving behind a loyal companion who had waited for weeks outside the hospital. What had Edward's final days been like, and was there more to his story than Thomas had uncovered? The more Thomas thought about it, the more he realized had to find out the full truth, not just for his own sake, but for Bruno's. Thomas had never been one to dwell on mysteries. His life as a doctor was dictated by facts, science, and cold hard reality. But ever since he had discovered Bruno's connection to Edward Langley, an unanswered question had begun gnawing at him. What was Edward, and what had led him to his final days at the hospital? Sitting on his couch, Bruno curled up beside him. Thomas absent-mindedly stroked the dog's fur as he scrolled through patient records on his laptop. Edward Langley, no next of kin, deceased from heart failure. It was all clinical, a simple end to a complicated life. But there had to be more. As soft whine from Bruno brought Thomas back to the present, the dog lifted his head, watching him expectantly. "You want answers too, don't you?" Thomas murmured. The next morning, Thomas took a detour before heading to the hospital. He drove back to Edward's house, hoping to find more clues. The house stood quiet and empty, a testament to a life left behind. Thomas hesitated before knocking on the neighbor's door. "Mrs. Patterson answered with a kind but weary smile. Dr. Walker, wasn't it? Yes, Thomas said, adjusting his scarf against the morning chill. I was hoping you might know more about Edward, about his life before the hospital. She sighed, opening the door wider. Come in, dear. It's too cold to talk on the porch. Inside, the house smelled of old books and brewed tea. Mrs. Patterson gestured for Thomas to sit as she poured 2 cups. Edward was a good man, she said, settling across from him. Lived alone, but he wasn't lonely, not with Bruno around. Thomas nodded. Did he have any family? Mrs. Patterson's face darkened slightly. He had a son, long ago, but they lost touch. That caught Thomas's attention. A son. She nodded. Daniel left town years back, and as far as I know, they never made amends. Thomas felt a stirring of something. Oh, maybe, if Edward had a son, perhaps Bruno wasn't alone after all. Do you know where he might be? Thomas asked. Mrs. Patterson shook her head. I'm afraid not. Edward never spoke much about it, only that he regretted how things had ended. Thomas frowned, sipping his tea. Did Edward ever mention why he brought Bruno to the hospital that day? Her eyes softened. He didn't, but if I had to guess, he knew he wasn't coming back, and he wanted Bruno to be close to him, even if it meant leaving him there. The weight of her words settled heavily on Thomas's chest. Edward hadn't abandoned Bruno, had made sure Bruno would find a place where he would be cared for. But Bruno, in his unwavering loyalty, hadn't understood. He had waited and waited. That night, Thomas Saturday with Bruno on the porch, the stars twinkling above them. We need to find Daniel, he murmured, running his fingers through Bruno's fur. If there's any chance of reconnecting you with your family, we have to try. Bruno gave a soft huff, his warm body pressed against Thomas's side. The doctor sighed, staring out into the quiet night. The pieces of Edward's past were beginning to come together, but there was still so much left unanswered. The search for Daniel Langley was about to begin. The morning air was crisp as Thomas stepped out of his car, Bruno trotting close behind him. The little dog had become more than just a stray he had taken, and was a reminder of the mystery Thomas couldn't let go. Somewhere out there, Daniel Langley, Edward's estranged son, might still be alive, and if there was any chance of reconnecting him with Bruno, Thomas had to try. Back at the hospital, Thomas found himself scrolling through online records between patient rounds, searching for any trace of Daniel. It was difficult. Years of lost contact meant little information was available. There were no immediate listings, no recent address records, just a name and a past that seemed buried beneath time. Sarah, the ever-curious nurse, noticed his distraction. You've been glued to that screen all morning, she said, setting a fresh cup of coffee on his desk. What's going on? Thomas sighed, rubbing his temples. I'm trying to find Edward Langley's son. Sarah raised an eyebrow. The man who owned Bruno. He nodded. Apparently, they lost touch years ago, but if I can't find him, maybe Bruno doesn't have to be alone. She smiled softly. That's sweet, Thomas, but what if it doesn't want to be found? Thomas considered that. Then at least I'll know I tried. Over the next few days, Thomas scoured every possible lead. He reached out to local records offices, checked social media, even visited the town's public archives. Each search led to more dead ends. Until one morning, when an unexpected email popped up in his inbox. Subject: Inquiry about Daniel Langley. Thomas's heartbeat quickened as he opened the message. It was from a woman named Claire Simmons, a local librarian. Dr. Walker, I saw your request about Daniel Langley in the town archives. I don't know where he is now, but I remember him. He used to visit the library often when he was younger. Last I heard, he left town for Chicago years ago. I don't know if he ever came back, but an old friend of his, Mark Henderson, still lives here. He might know more. Hope this helps. Claire Simmons. Thomas stared at the message. A lead, a real one. He immediately scribbled down Mark Henderson's name and address before grabbing his coat. "Come on, Bruno," he said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "We've got someone to talk to." Mark Henderson's house was a modest one on the outskirts of town. Thomas knocked firmly on the door, his breath forming misty clouds in the cold air. Bruno Saturday patiently beside him, ears perked. A few moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a man in his late 40s with graying hair and wary eyes. "Can I help you?" Mark asked cautiously. Thomas cleared his throat. "My name is Dr. Walker. I work at the hospital. I'm looking for information about Daniel Langley." At the mention of the name, Mark stiffened. He studied Thomas for a long moment before glancing down at Bruno. "Edward's dog," he murmured, almost to himself. Thomas nodded. "You knew Edward?" Mark sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Yeah, I knew him, and I knew Daniel too, back when we were kids." Thomas felt a flicker of hope. "Do you know where he is now?" Mark hesitated before stepping outside, closing the door behind him. "Last I heard, he was in Chicago. We haven't spoken in years." "Do you have any way to contact him?" Thomas pressed. "It's important." Mark frowned. "Why are you looking for him?" Thomas exhaled. "His father passed away a few weeks ago. Bruno here has been waiting outside the hospital ever since, as if he's still hoping Edward will come back. I just thought, if Daniel knew, maybe he'd want to take him in." Mark's face softened as he looked at Bruno. The little dog stared up at him, tail wagging slightly. "He was always good with animals," Mark said quietly. "Daniel, he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't have a phone number, but I know someone who might. Give me a day or two." Thomas nodded. "Thank you." The wait was agonizing. Each day, Thomas checked his phone, hoping for a message from Mark. He distracted himself with work, with Bruno's care, with anything that could keep his mind occupied. But the question lingered: if they found Daniel, would he even care? Finally, late one evening, Thomas's phone buzzed. A message from Mark. "Got a number? It's old, but worth a shot." A phone number followed. Thomas's fingers hovered over the screen before he took a deep breath and dialed. The line ran once, twice, 3 times. Then a voice answered. "Hello." Thomas hesitated. "Is this Daniel Langley?" A pause. "Who's asking?" "My name is Dr. Thomas Walker. I work at the hospital in your father's town." Another silence, longer this time. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was guarded. "What do you want?" Thomas glanced down at Bruno, who was sitting by his feet, ears perked. "I think you should know," Thomas said carefully, "that your father has passed away." A long silence, then a sharp inhale. "I see." Thomas waited, giving him time to process. Finally, Daniel's voice came again, quieter this time. "And why is a doctor calling me about it?" Thomas swallowed. "Because your father had a dog. His name is Bruno, and for weeks, he's been waiting outside the hospital, as if expecting your father to return. I thought you might want to know." Another pause, then Daniel's voice, strained. "Bruno's still there." Thomas nodded. Even though Daniel couldn't see, he never left. Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Daniel spoke. "I'll be there as soon as I can." The next morning, Thomas Saturday at the hospital cafeteria, his fingers drumming anxiously against the table as he sipped his coffee. Bruno Saturday at his feet, tail curled around his body, occasionally lifting his head to glance up at his newfound guardian. The call with Daniel still lingered in Thomas's mind. His voice had been cold, distant, guarded, but he had agreed to come. That was a start. Thomas wasn't sure what to expect. Would Daniel rush into town with regret in his heart, desperate to make amends? Or would he simply show up out of obligation, staying only long enough to settle whatever loose ends his father had left behind? He hoped for the former, but braced for the latter. By mid-afternoon, Thomas received a text from an unfamiliar number. "Arriving soon. Where can we meet?" Thomas exhaled and quickly responded. Hospital entrance. I'll be waiting. As the minutes passed, Thomas found himself glancing toward the door every few seconds. Bruno, as if sensing the anticipation, Saturday upright, ears perked, his dark eyes watching the revolving doors. Finally, a tall figure entered the hospital lobby, dressed in a dark coat and carrying nothing but a small duffel bag. Daniel Langley stood at the threshold, scanning the room with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and hesitation. Thomas rose, taking a step forward. Daniel. The man turned toward him, his gaze unreadable. Dr. Walker. Thomas nodded and extended a hand. Daniel hesitated before shaking it, his grip firm but brief. Then his eyes landed on Bruno. The little dog remained still for a moment, as if studying the man before him. Then, recognition sparked. His tail began to wag slowly, then faster, his entire body vibrating with excitement. A small whimper escaped him before he stood, taking hesitant steps toward Daniel. Daniel crouched down, his expression softening in a way that surprised Thomas. Hey, buddy, he murmured, reaching out. The moment his fingers brushed Bruno's fur, the dog closed the distance, pressing against him with an eagerness that spoke volumes. A quiet sound, half sob, half laugh, escaped Daniel as he ran his hand down Bruno's back. Thomas watched in silence, something tightening in his chest. This was more than just a reunion. It was the closing of a wound that had remained open for far too long. After a long moment, Daniel stood, clearing his throat. I can't believe he's still here. Thomas crossed his arms. He never left, not since the night your father was admitted. Daniel exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I should have come sooner. You're here now, Thomas said simply. That's what matters. Daniel's jaw tightened. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Thomas studied him. Start by telling me what happened between you and your father. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. That's a long story. I've got time. For a moment, it seemed as though Daniel was shut down, but then he let out a slow breath and nodded. All right, but not here. They Saturday on a bench outside the hospital. Bruno curled up between them. The air was crisp, the sky painted with the deep oranges and purples of an approaching evening. Daniel stared out at the horizon. My father and I, we never saw eye to eye. I left home when I was 20, thinking I'd never look back. Thomas remained silent, letting him continue at his own pace. He was a good man, Daniel admitted, but he had his ways. He believed in sacrifice, in giving everything for others, and he expected the same from me. Thomas frowned. He wanted you to follow in his footsteps. Daniel nodded. He was a veteran, did years of service. Then he spent the rest of his life helping others, volunteering, always putting everyone else first. His voice turned bitter, and he wanted me to do the same. You didn't want that path. I wanted my own life, Daniel said simply. I wanted to choose for myself, not just follow in his shadow. When I told him I was leaving, he told me I was selfish, that I was walking away from everything he had taught me. He exhaled sharply. We stopped talking after that. Thomas nodded slowly. And now? Daniel ran a hand over his face. Nah, I don't know. I spent years convincing myself I didn't care, that I was better off without him. But hearing he's gone, he trailed off, shaking his head. I don't know what to feel. Thomas glanced down at Bruno, who had curled up against Daniel's side, completely at peace. He never stopped waiting for you, you know. Daniel swallowed hard, his hand resting on the dog's back. Neither did my father, did he? Thomas didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence stretched between them until Daniel finally spoke again. What happens now? That's up to you, Thomas said. But Bruno, he needs someone. He's been waiting for too long. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then, he nodded, a decision settling in his eyes. I'll take him home. Thomas felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. He had grown used to Bruno's presence, his quiet companionship, but this was what was right. Still, As Daniel reached down to lift Bruno into his arms, the little dog hesitated. His eyes flicked between Daniel and Thomas, as if torn between the past and the present. Thomas forced a small smile and knelt beside him. "It's okay, Bruno. You're going home." Bruno let out a soft whimper before pressing his nose against Thomas's hand. Then, with one last glance, he settled against Daniel's chest. Thomas stood, watching as they walked away, and for the first time, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the ending Bruno had been waiting for all along. The house felt emptier than usual. Thomas then realized just how much Bruno's presence had filled the quiet spaces until now. The little dog had only been with him for a short while, yet somehow, the house already felt hollow without the soft patter of his paws, the quiet sighs as it curled up beside him, the unwavering eyes that held so much history. Thomas Saturday on the couch, staring at the empty dog bed in the corner of the living room. He had told himself that letting Bruno go was the right thing to do, and it was, but the ache in his chest told him a different story. Sighing, he reached for his phone and scrolled through the old messages from Mark Henderson, the man who had helped him find Daniel. He hesitated before typing a new message. Did Daniel make it back safely? A few minutes passed before a reply came. Yeah, he picked Bruno up this morning and headed back to Chicago. Seemed conflicted. Thomas exhaled slowly. He wasn't surprised. Daniel had spent years running from his father's shadow, only to be drawn back in by a past he had tried to bury. It would take time for him to adjust, for both of them to heal. The next few days at the hospital were routine, yet Thomas found himself more distracted than usual. During lunch breaks, he would catch himself glancing at the hospital entrance, half expecting to see Bruno curled up in his usual spot. Even Sarah, who had a keen eye for these things, eventually noticed. "You miss him, don't you?" she asked one afternoon as she sat beside him in the cafeteria. Thomas gave a half smile. "Not obvious." Sarah smirked. "You've been looking at the front doors, like he's going to come trotting in any second now." Thomas exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I know I did the right thing, but it's strange. I got so used to him being around." Sarah stirred her coffee. "Maybe it wasn't just about Bruno. Maybe it's about what he represented." Thomas looked at her, brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She leaned forward slightly. "You said it yourself. Bruno never gave up waiting for Edward. That kind of loyalty, it's rare, and I think, in a way, you saw something in him that you weren't ready to admit to yourself." Thomas remained quiet. He had always been someone who put work above personal connections, but for the first time in a long while, he had let someone in. Granted, it had been a four-legged companion, but the impact had been undeniable. "You think I got too attached?" he asked finally. Sarah smiled. "I think you finally let yourself care." That night, Thomas Saturday by the fireplace, lost in thought. It had been a long time since he had felt this restless. He told himself it would pass that in time. He'd go back to his usual routine, but a small voice in the back of his mind whispered otherwise. Then, a message lit up his phone. "Hey, Dr. Walker, it's Daniel." Thomas Saturday up straighter, his heartbeat quickening as he opened the message. "I wanted to say thank you for everything. Bruno's adjusting, but I can tell he misses something or someone." Thomas swallowed hard, unsure how to respond, but before he could type anything, another message appeared. "Would you be willing to visit?" He stared at the screen, debating. He hadn't expected this. Letting Bruno go had felt like closing a chapter, but now it seemed that chapter wasn't quite finished. Finally, he typed back, "I like that." Thomas stared at the message for a long time, rereading Daniel's words as if to confirm their meaning. He hadn't expected to hear from him again, much less receive an invitation. Yet, here it was, an open door, a chance to see Bruno again, and perhaps to understand something deeper about himself. He hesitated before typing his response. When would be a good time? The reply came quickly. Whenever you're free. Bruno's been a little restless. I think he'd like to see you. Thomas allowed himself a small smile. The idea that Bruno missed him, that there was still a bond there, filled him with something he couldn't quite define. He took a deep breath before replying, I'll drive up this weekend. The drive to Chicago was long, but gave Thomas time to think. He hadn't taken much time off from working years, and now, here he was, heading toward an unfamiliar city for reasons he couldn't quite explain. He told himself it was just about Bruno, making sure the dog was adjusting, but deep down, he knew there was more to it. As he pulled into the city limits, his GPS guided him to a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts. The streets were lined with rows of townhouses, their small yards adorned with patches of autumn leaves. He parked in front of Daniel's address and exhaled, gripping the steering wheel for a moment before stepping out. Before he could knock, the door swung open. Daniel stood there, looking slightly disheveled, but genuinely relieved. You made it? Thomas nodded. Yeah, long drive, but worth it. Daniel stepped aside. Come in. The house was modest but well kept. It had a lived-in feel, like someone trying to build something stable despite years of uncertainty. And then, just as Thomas had expected, Bruno came trotting from the other room. He was perking up the moment he spotted him. Thomas knelt instinctively, bracing himself as Bruno bounded toward him, tail wagging so fast it was a blur. He let out a series of excited whimpers before pressing his head against Thomas's chest. Hey, buddy, Thomas murmured, scratching behind his ears. Miss you too. Daniel watched the exchange from a few feet away, arms crossed, something unreadable in his expression. He's been doing that a lot, he said after a moment, looking around, waiting for something. I guess he thought you weren't coming back. Thomas swallowed against the unexpected lump in his throat. I wasn't sure if I would. Silence settled between them, filled only by the soft sounds of Bruno's tail thumping against the floor. Daniel gestured toward the kitchen. Want some coffee? Thomas nodded, following him. He took a seat at the small dining table, while Daniel poured the cups, sliding one over. It was a simple gesture, but it carried weight an attempt at something neither of them quite knew how to name. You're not what I expected, Daniel admitted, sitting across from him. When you first called, I thought, I don't know, that you were just doing this out of some obligation, but then I saw how Bruno reacted to you. Thomas took a sip of his coffee, considering his words. I didn't expect any of this either, he admitted. I thought I was just helping a stray dog. Turns out, he helped me more than I realized. Daniel nodded slowly. My dad used to say that about him, that Bruno wasn't just a pet, was a reminder that no one should go through life alone. Thomas glanced at the dog, now lying comfortably between them, content but alert. He thought about Edward Langley, the man who had waited for his son to come back, and about Bruno, who had waited for his owner to return. And then there was himself, man who had never realized how lonely he was until a small, devoted creature had shown up outside his hospital doors. He was right, Thomas finally said. Daniel let out a quiet chuckle. Yeah, he usually was. Another stretch of silence, this time not quite so heavy. Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now, he admitted. I spent so long staying away. Now that I'm here, it's like I don't know where to start. Thomas understood that feeling all too well. You start small, he said. You take care of Bruno. You remember your father in the way that matters, and you figure the rest out as you go. Daniel exhaled, staring down at his coffee. Yeah, I guess that's all I can do. Bruno let out a soft sigh, as if agreeing. As the evening stretched on, conversation flowed more easily. They talked about Edward, about the memories Daniel still held on to. They talked about Bruno's quirks, about the way he still refused to sleep in a different spot at night, as if holding on to something invisible. And somewhere along the way, the weight of the past didn't seem as heavy. When Thomas finally stood to leave, Bruno followed him to the door. Hesitating at the threshold, Thomas knelt again, ruffling his fur. "You're home now, buddy. You're where you're supposed to be." Bruno gave a soft whine but didn't resist when Thomas stood. Daniel watched the exchange before speaking. "You can come back, whenever you want." Thomas met his gaze, surprised by the sincerity there. He nodded. "I might take you up on that." As he stepped outside, the night air crisp against his skin, he realized something. Maybe he wasn't just leaving something behind this time. Maybe, for the first time in a long while, he was walking towards something worth holding on to. The drive back home was quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional sigh that escaped Thomas's lips. The city lights of Chicago faded in the distance, replaced by the open stretches of highway. He gripped the wheel, his thoughts drifting between the past and the present. Seeing Bruno again had stirred something inside him, something he hadn't fully prepared for. He had convinced himself that letting go was the right thing to do, that Bruno belonged with Daniel, the last link to Edward's legacy. And yet, as he replayed the look in Bruno's eyes when he left, a dull ache settled in his chest. By the time Thomas pulled into his driveway, exhaustion weighed heavily on his shoulders. He stepped out of the car, locking it behind him before glancing at the empty front porch. No small paws padding across the wooden steps, no expectant brown eyes watching him from the corner of the room. The silence felt louder than he had anticipated. With a sigh, he pushed open the door, stepping into the dimly lit house. The absence of Bruno was stark. The dog bed in the corner remained untouched, the water bowl still half full from the last time he had been here. He had spent years living alone, yet for the first time, solitude felt like an unwanted companion. Thomas moved to the couch, sinking into the cushions as he ran a hand down his face. He had done the right thing, so why did it feel like something was missing? The following week at the hospital was uneventful. The usual cases, the usual exhaustion, but something had shifted. Thomas found himself more distracted than usual, his mind drifting back to Chicago, to Daniel, to Bruno. Sarah noticed, of course, she always did. "You're doing that thing again," she said one afternoon as they stood by the nurse's station, reviewing patient files. Thomas blinked, glancing up. What then? The brooding, the whole lost in thought, staring into the distance like a tragic hero thing. He scoffed, shaking his head. "I don't do that." Sarah arched an eyebrow. "You totally do." She paused, then leaned against the counter, lowering her voice. "You miss him, don't you?" Thomas exhaled. "I don't know if it's that. I mean, he's where he's supposed to be, but it's weird not having him around." Sarah studied him for a moment before nodding. "You got attached, and that's not a bad thing." Thomas ran a hand through his hair. "I just didn't expect it. Sometimes the best things in life are unexpected." He let out a dry chuckle. "Now you sound like a greeting card." She grinned. "Well, it's true." That evening, Thomas Saturday on his porch, a cup of coffee in hand. The sky was a mix of deep blues and purples, the first stars twinkling above. He stared at the empty spot where Bruno had once curled up beside him. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Daniel." He hesitated before opening the message. "Bruno's doing better. He's settling in, but he still waits by the door sometimes, like he's expecting something." Thomas's fingers hovered over the keyboard before he typed back. "That's just who he is. He doesn't forget the people he cares about." A pause, then another message. "You should visit again soon." Thomas stared at the screen, his heart pounding slightly. He had thought his part in Bruno's story was over, but maybe, just maybe, some stories didn't have to end so quickly. After a moment, he typed back, "I will." The invitation had lingered in Thomas's mind for days. Daniel's words, "you should visit again soon," played on repeat in his head, intertwining with the memory of Bruno's expectant eyes the last time he saw him. He told himself he was busy, that work at the hospital wouldn't allow for another trip so soon. But the truth was, He hesitated for reasons he couldn't fully explain. That hesitation finally broke on a quiet Friday evening. Sitting on his porch, the weight of an empty house pressing down on him, Thomas made the decision. He pulled out his phone and typed a message. "I'll come by this weekend. See you soon." The reply was almost immediate. "Bruno will be happy to see you." The drive to Chicago felt different this time, less uncertain, more intentional. The first time, he had gone out of duty, driven by the idea of helping someone move forward. Now, there was something else, an unspoken pull, a feeling of belonging to a story he hadn't realized he was part of. As he parked outside Daniel's townhouse, a strange mix of anticipation and nervousness settled in his chest. He barely had time to compose himself before the door opened, and Bruno came barreling out, tail wagging furiously. Thomas barely had time to kneel before the little dog launched himself at him, paws pressing eagerly against his chest. A laugh bubbled up from Thomas as he steadied Bruno, rubbing his ears. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, "miss me?" Bruno let out an excited bark before circling him in happy bursts, his energy infectious. Daniel stood at the doorway, arms crossed, watching the scene with an amused expression. "I'd say he remembers you." Thomas straightened, clearing his throat. "Yeah, well, hard to forget a face like mine." Daniel smirked. "Come inside before he knocks you over." The warmth of the house was comforting, a stark contrast to the cold outside. Thomas took a seat on the couch, Bruno immediately hopping up beside him, as if reclaiming his usual spot. Daniel handed him a coffee, settling in across from him, as "Oh, how's life back at the hospital?" Thomas exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Same as always, long hours, too many patients, not enough time." Daniel nodded knowingly. "Sounds like my dad." Thomas hesitated. He had thought a lot about Edward Langley since their last conversation. How much of his life had been dedicated to others, how much he had sacrificed. Looking at Daniel now, he saw shades of that same strugglesome in trying to balance a past they hadn't fully made peace with. "You've been doing all right?" Thomas asked carefully. Daniel shrugged, trying. "It's been weird, having Bruno around. Good, but weird. Like there's this piece of my dad that's still here, watching over me." Thomas glanced down at Bruno, who rested his head on his lap, eyes half closed in contentment. "I think that's exactly what he'd want." Daniel let out a breathy chuckle. "Yeah, maybe." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Daniel leaned forward, an uncertain look in his eyes. "Listen, I wanted to ask you something." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." Daniel hesitated. "I know you've got a life back home, a job that keeps you busy, but you're welcome here, anytime." Thomas blinked. Of all the things he had expected, that wasn't one of them. "You sure?" Daniel smirked. "Bruno's been waiting by the door every night since you left. I think he'd like it." Thomas chuckled, scratching behind Bruno's ears. "Well, I wouldn't want to disappoint him." Daniel's smile softened. "Yeah, me neither." As the evening stretched on, the conversation drifted from the heavy to the light. They talked about music, about places they had been, about things they had yet to do. And somewhere along the way, Thomas realized something. This wasn't just about Bruno anymore. This was about finding a place where he belonged. The next morning, Thomas woke up to the faint sound of paws patting against the wooden floor. He opened his eyes to find Bruno standing by the bedside, tail wagging tentatively, his deep brown eyes watching him expectantly. Thomas chuckled. "Morning, buddy. You keeping an eye on me?" Bruno let out a quiet huff before hopping onto the bed and curling up beside him. The warmth of the little dog was comforting in a way Thomas hadn't fully expected. He ran a hand through Bruno's fur, realizing just how much he had missed this simple presence. Downstairs, Daniel was already making coffee, the rich aroma filling the air. When Thomas entered the kitchen, Daniel glanced up and smirked. "So, how's it feel waking up in Chicago again?" Thomas poured himself a cup before leaning against the counter. Not bad. Different. Daniel nodded knowingly. Yeah, it takes getting used to, but you don't seem like you're in a hurry to leave. Thomas exhaled, staring down into his coffee. I don't know. Something about being here. It feels like it's where I should be right now. Daniel studied him for a moment before nodding. Well, that's a start. The day passed in an easy rhythm. They took Bruno for a walk through the park. The crisp autumn air refreshing against their skin. Bruno trotted ahead, tail wagging excitedly, pausing every few steps to make sure Thomas was still close. He really is attached to you, Daniel mused, watching the way Bruno kept circling back to Thomas. Thomas smiled. Yeah, I guess I am too. They found a bench near the lake and sat down, watching the water ripple gently under the breeze. I used to come here with my dad, Daniel admitted after a moment, before things got complicated. He loved this place, said it gave him time to think. Thomas glanced at him. Maybe that's why you keep coming back? Daniel let out a small chuckle. Maybe. I guess a part of me thought if I stayed away long enough, I'd forget. But the funny thing is, no matter how far I went, memories have a way of catching up to you. Thomas nodded, understanding more than he wanted to admit. Yeah, they do. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that comes when words are needed, when both people know there's an understanding that goes beyond what can be spoken aloud. After a while, Daniel turned to him. Have you ever thought about staying? Thomas blinked. In Chicago? Daniel nodded. I mean, your job is great, but you're not tied to that hospital, right? You could work anywhere? Thomas hesitated. I never really thought about it. Daniel smirked. Maybe you should. They both turned as Bruno barked suddenly, chasing after a fallen leaf that danced in the wind. Thomas laughed, watching as the little dog pounced on it, only for the wind to sweep it away again. Maybe Daniel was right. Maybe it was time to stop running from things he didn't even realize he was running from. Maybe, for the first time in a long while, he had finally found a place to belong. The decision weighed on Thomas more than he had anticipated. The idea of staying in Chicago had never been part of his plan, yet now it loomed over him with an unexpected pull. He had spent years rooted in his work, convinced that his purpose was tied solely to the hospital, but something had shifted, something he couldn't ignore. Bruno, as always, seemed attuned to his thoughts. That evening, as Thomas sat on the couch, lost in contemplation, the little dog nestled against his side. The gentle rise and fall of Bruno's breathing was steady, comforting. You always seem to know what's going on in my head, Thomas murmured, scratching behind Bruno's ears. The dog's tail gave a soft wag in response, his eyes half-lit in contentment. Daniel entered the room, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He handed one to Thomas, before settling into the armchair across from him. You look like a man stuck between 2 roads. Thomas let out a quiet laugh. That obvious. Daniel smirked. I've been there, more times than I care to admit. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. Finally, Thomas spoke. I never thought I'd consider leaving my job. It's been my life for so long, but being here, with Bruno, with you, it's made me realize I don't really have anything waiting for me back home. Daniel nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. I get it. Change is terrifying, but sometimes it's exactly what we need. Thomas exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. I don't even know where to start. Moving, finding a new job, uprooting everything. Daniel shrugged. You don't have to figure it all out at once. Just take one step, see where it leads. Bruno let out a soft huff, as if agreeing. Thomas chuckled, running his fingers through the dog's fur. You're both terrible influences. Daniel smirked. We prefer to think of it as good advice. As the night stretched on, Thomas found himself easing into the idea. It wasn't just about changing locations, it was about choosing a life that made sense. A life where he wasn't just going through the motions, but actually living. By the time he retired to bed, The decision was still forming, still uncertain, but for the first time, it didn't scare him. Maybe, just maybe, he was ready to choose something different. The following morning, Thomas woke with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The weight of indecision had lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of resolution. He didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time, that didn't scare him. Bruno stretched beside him, letting out a soft yawn before looking up expectantly. Thomas chuckled and gave the dog a gentle pat. "You're enjoying this new routine, aren't you?" Downstairs, the smell of fresh coffee greeted him. Daniel stood by the counter, scrolling through his phone, but he looked up as Thomas entered. "Morning. Sleep okay?" "Yeah," Thomas said, pouring himself a cup. "Actually, I did." Daniel studied him for a moment before nodding. "You look like a man who made a decision." Thomas exhaled and leaned against the counter. "I think I have. I don't know exactly how everything will work out, but I want to stay, at least for a while." Daniel smirked. "Bruno's gonna be thrilled." Thomas chuckled, glancing down at the little dog, who was happily sniffing around the kitchen floor. "Yeah, I think so too." They sat at the small dining table, sipping their coffee in a comfortable silence. Thomas stared out the window, watching the city slowly wake up. "I need to figure out the job situation," he mused. "See what's out there for me." Daniel nodded. "You know, I have a friend who works at a clinic nearby. It's smaller than the hospital you used to, but it could be a good start." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You think they'd be interested?" "Can't hurt to ask." Thomas took a sip of coffee, mulling over the idea. A smaller clinic, a different pace. Maybe it was exactly what he needed. Later that day, Thomas found himself walking through the city streets, Bruno trotting happily at his side. The thought of starting over in a new place should have felt overwhelming, but instead, it felt like possibility. He had spent so much of his life dedicating himself to work, to the idea that purpose only came from long hours and self-sacrifice. But maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than that. Bruno barked excitedly as they neared the park, his tail wagging as he pulled Thomas forward. He let out a small laugh, giving in to the dog's excitement. As they walked, Thomas thought about the road ahead. There were still so many unknowns, but for the first time, he was ready to embrace them. He wasn't just choosing a new city, a new job. He was choosing a life where he wasn't just existing but truly living. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like the right decision. Thomas had always believed that life was meant to be planned. Every step, every choice, calculated and methodical, but as he stood in his new apartment, surrounded by unpacked boxes and the distant hum of city life outside, he realized that some of the best things in life happened when you stopped planning and started living. Bruno trotted across the wooden floor, sniffing at the unfamiliar space, before hopping onto the couch like he had always belonged there. Thomas chuckled, shaking his head. "You settle in fast, don't you?" The move hadn't been easy. Saying goodbye to his old life, to the comfort of routine, had been more challenging than he had anticipated, but as he adjusted to the rhythm of Chicago, he felt something he hadn't in years: excitement for the unknown. The clinic Daniel had mentioned had welcomed him with open arms. It wasn't the fast-paced, high-pressure environment he was used to, but that was exactly why he liked it. Here, he had time for his patients, time to breathe, time to rediscover why he had chosen this profession in the first place. One evening, after his shift, Thomas found himself back at the park where he had Saturday with Daniel weeks ago. The lake shimmered under the fading sunlight, and the crisp autumn air carried the sounds of laughter and distant city traffic. Daniel arrived a few minutes later, hands in his pockets, a knowing smirk on his face. "So, how's the city treating you?" Thomas exhaled, glancing down at Bruno, who sat contentedly at his feet. "It's different, but I think that's a good thing." Daniel nodded. "It suits you." They sat in silence for a while, watching the waves ripple against the shore. Finally, Daniel spoke. You ever wonder if things happen for a reason? Thomas tilted his head. I used to think everything had to have a reason. Now, I think some things just happen, and we choose what to do with them. Daniel smirked. Sounds like you're finally learning to go with the flow. Thomas laughed. Maybe I am? Bruno let out a happy bark. As if agreeing, Thomas reached down to ruffle the dog's fur. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the next step, the next goal, the next obligation. He was here, in this moment, and that was enough. He had spent so long searching for a place to belong, only to realize that belonging wasn't about a place. It was about the people and moments that made life worth living. And as he sat there, the city lights reflecting on the water, Bruno curled up beside him, and Daniel sitting in companionable silence, he knew he had finally found it. A new beginning, a new home, a new life. And he was ready for all of it. Thank you for watching until the very end. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like the video and share it with your friends. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell for more inspiring stories. Have a wonderful day.